This is the CBS Evening News. Dan Rather reporting again tonight from inside the Kremlin. Second day of the Reagan-Gorbachev-Moscow summit. They are pressing their private agendas. Mr. Reagan is trying to ensure his place in history. General Secretary Gorbachev is trying to ensure he has a future. And in an extraordinary interview with CBS News, the reform-minded former top political boss of Moscow, former Politburo member and Gorbachev right-hand man, Boris Yeltsin, points a finger at the current Politburo number 2 man, Yegor Ligachev. Yeltsin says Ligachev is an obstacle to Gorbachev's reforms. We'll have that interview shortly. First, President Reagan's day. The centerpiece of this day, and of Mr. Reagan's own personal summit agenda, was framed around an unprecedented gathering of dissidents, refuseniks, religious believers, and their families, all invited to Spaso House, the U.S. ambassador's residence in Moscow, to tell their stories, to tell those stories directly to the president.
В этих условиях курс перемен неустойчив.
The course of change is uncertain, says Sergei Kovalov, and our hopes are shaky. The current unstable situation could at any time be turned around.
Despite democratization, our lot has not improved.
Yuli Kozarovsky told his story in Mr. Reagan's own language.
Mr. President, I am a Jew, a refusenik. I have been denied permission to emigrate for the last 17 years. And this life as a refusenik made me see that the whole Jewish people in the Soviet Union were made refuseniks.
Many said they considered the U.S. president their last hope. Mr. Reagan spoke of their courage.
I came here hoping to do what I could to give you strength. Yet I already know it is you who have strengthened me. You who have given me a message to carry back. While we press for human rights through diplomatic channels, you press with your very lives.
He hinted that he hadn't spoken his last to Gorbachev on human rights.
Nancy and I have to leave you. We're going to have a little talk with the General Secretary.
And the Soviets hit back today in Pravda. On the front page, a vignette of the smiling Gorbachevs and Reagans, but inside, heavy play given to a picture of America's homeless, looking for a handout and a meal. The Soviet media and foreign ministry went on to ridicule the Reagan meeting with dissidents at Spaso House.
I can tell you that they are not the best of the Soviet public. Rather, on the contrary.
This was the human and religious rights event the Kremlin wanted reporters to cover today, renovating the artifacts of the church, not restoring the church's position. The Soviets have no word for photo opportunity. They do know how to stage an event. The church bells of the 13th century Danilov Monastery in Moscow chimed for the Reagans, something they rarely do otherwise. The monastery has been renovated in recent years to mark 1,000 years of Russian Christianity. Mr. Reagan prayed that Gorbachev's moves toward openness and freedom would go wider and be permanent.
We don't know if this first thaw will be followed by a resurgent spring of religious liberty. We don't know, but we may hope.
Some of the answers President Reagan and General Secretary Gorbachev gave to reporters before their private summit session also hinted at the turmoil over human rights. Asked about a list of Jewish refuseniks, Gorbachev seemed to flare a bit.
Well, there are quite a few. There are too many lists.
Gorbachev also tried to take some of the sting out of the human rights debate by doing what many a Western politician does, in effect proposing a commission to study the problem. In this case, a panel that would meet with counterparts in the United States. Behind closed doors in St. Catherine's Hall, the official summit subject today was arms control. Reportedly, both sides traded ideas on reducing long-range nuclear weapons. They reportedly moved somewhat closer on 2 minor arms agreements. Nancy Reagan's day today included a tour of reading, writing, and Russian children. A visit to a Moscow schoolhouse where English is taught and sung. And outside Moscow, Mrs. Reagan visited the summer home and the grave of Boris Pasternak, the author whose works were suppressed in his own country until recently. President Reagan quoted another author, Russia's best-loved poet, Alexander Pushkin, in pressing Gorbachev on human and religious rights. It's time, my friend. It's time. With me again, as he has been throughout our coverage from inside the Kremlin, Charles Kurov. And Charlie, we're walking in the center of what used to be called the Holy Kremlin, Cathedral Square.
Yes, this place is a great architectural reminder, isn't it, of the time in Russia when church and state were one. All you have to do is take a look around inside the Kremlin to see the importance the Tsars gave to the Orthodox Church. The church collaborated with the Tsars for more than 900 years in perpetuating a system of serfdom and inequality. Of course, these churches in the Kremlin aren't churches anymore. What's interesting, Dan, is that in giving the church a little more breathing room, Mikhail Gorbachev is obviously trying to reach a new collaboration with the church, to use the church to accomplish his aims, just as the Tsars did. When the church bells ring at the Danilov Monastery, it is a rare and wondrous sound, as you said, Dan. In the Soviet Union, church bells come under the category of disturbing the peace. Gorbachev is letting these bells ring. The head of the monastery, Father Tikhon, doesn't want to push Gorbachev too far. He would be glad to see the anti-religion laws changed, but in the meantime, he says, we have to exercise our faith in accordance with the laws. The real disturbers of the peace are simple priests like Gleb Yakunin. In 1965, he denounced his church for turning over the names of worshipers to the police. This was repeating the role of Judas, he says, betraying the people who came to the church. They stripped him of his priesthood. He responded with a barrage of public documents proving religious persecution. They sentenced him to 5 years in prison, and after that, 30 months exile in Siberia. He remained defiant. They took away his Bible. He went on a hunger strike until he got it back. When he was freed by a Gorbachev amnesty last year, he went right back to disturbing the peace again, denouncing his patriarch for defending the Soviet record on human rights. This, he says, was an offense against the memory of millions of innocent victims. After all he has been through, Gleb Yakunin's eyes still flash with defiance. And he has allies now. This is a meeting of the Soviet Government Peace Committee. How's this for disturbing the peace? This man says, how can you talk about freedom of conscience if the schools force atheism down our throats? This is a crime. Looking on with approval at all this is a man named Alexander Ogorodnikov. He spent 8.5 years in jail and in exile for violating the laws on religion. Now he too is back, editing a journal on religious persecution. You can't live freely here, he says. We're living with a gag in our mouths and our arms tied. Only because of glasnost, the gag is becoming looser. He is being harassed by the KGB, but it's hard to imagine Alexander Ogorodnikov being gagged. Gorbachev would like to reach a compromise with the church, but in the fierce souls of Gleb Yakunin and Alexander Ogorodnikov, there is no compromise. They want religious freedom, nothing less. They will suffer any pain to get it, and they will seek help wherever they can. Today, they sought help from President Reagan. Alexander Ogorodnikov was there when the president met with the dissidents, and Father Gleb Yakunin, whose government has been trying to suppress him for more than 20 years, who 1 year ago was in exile in Siberia, Gleb Yakunin found himself mounting the rostrum to speak face-to-face to the President of the United States and the whole wide world. He said, of course he said, while I have been released, many prisoners of conscience still are languishing in prisons, labor camps, in exile, and in psychiatric hospitals. He named some of those still imprisoned, and in the end, he said to President Reagan, God bless you. Gorbachev has permitted the question of religion to start simmering. The people in that room today want to bring it to a boil. At one church, the bells are ringing again. Gorbachev would like that to be enough, Dan, but it isn't.
One would guess not nearly enough. Thanks, Charles. We'll be back in a moment with a rather extraordinary interview with the outspoken, demoted, down but not out Gorbachev Lieutenant Boris Yeltsin.
You've probably heard about pain relievers that sound new, but they're not new to hospitals. For years, hospitals have known about ibuprofen, aspirin, and Tylenol products. And today, their overwhelming choice, Tylenol. In fact, last year, they dispensed Tylenol 10 times more than the leading aspirin and ibuprofen brands combined. If hospitals use Tylenol most, shouldn't your choice be Tylenol too? Tylenol, the pain reliever hospitals use most.
I don't know whether to begin without him. I'm sure he's just sitting in that awful traffic.
Steve, in his new 190 class Mercedes, sitting in traffic. Oh, sure, he's sitting there in line, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel, tapping his foot, fiddling with the radio stations, staring at the taillights of the car in front of him. Marie, I've commuted with Steve.
What's that supposed to mean?
Well, it means... That's what it means.
Captain, this itchy rash is driving me crazy.
Why didn't you use the Cortaid?
Cortaid goes beneath the skin to actually heal itches and rashes.
You know, itches and rashes won't last if you use Cortaid first.
Ex-Lax presents a gentle guarantee. A guarantee that Ex-Lax works gently by 8 a.m. when taken at bedtime or your money back. A promise you can count on. Ex-Lax, guaranteed complete relief by 8 a.m.
1 year ago, when CBS News was in the Soviet Union for the program 7 Days in May, the man who stole the show was Boris Nikolaevich Yeltsin. He was a populist politician, a shrewd and popular one, kind of a younger combination of Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan. And he was a Gorbachev lieutenant, the fastest rising star inside the Communist Party.
ЦСКА плохо идет в этом году.
As party chief of Moscow, Yeltsin was on the streets, talking to people, hounding bureaucrats and managers, point man for Gorbachev. He felt himself free to criticize everyone, including colleagues in the Politburo. Boris Yeltsin finally went too far, made too many enemies, and last winter, Gorbachev was forced to bounce him from the Politburo leadership. Yeltsin was demoted to the construction ministry. But when I talked to him today, I found Boris Yeltsin looking and sounding like a winner and still attacking the enemies of perestroika.
I think a certain renewal in the composition of the Politburo would benefit perestroika.
That's Sovietese for throw the rascals out.
I think that the process is much slower than we expected, considerably slower. And to overestimate what is happening and to speak and to say that everything is going according to the plan isn't only an error, this is a dangerous thing to say. But not everybody agrees with me on that, especially referring to the social problems on which I had and have different views with Ligachev.
Igor Ligachev, currently number 2 in the Politburo and reputedly the leader of the Go Slow School of Reform. Are Ligachev and those who think like him holding back perestroika and glasnost?
In his words and his speeches, you can never find this. But it is possible to be an opponent without actively participating.
So the answer is yes.
That is indeed the style of his work against which we are fighting. It contradicts the spirit of perestroika.
Clearly, Yeltsin believes that Ligachev has to go if Gorbachev's campaign for reform is really to succeed. Boris Yeltsin's outspoken comments are, according to analysts, more than bitter aftertaste of a man who's out of power. It looks to some outsiders that Mikhail Gorbachev is continuing to increase his authority, that those who oppose him are being routed, and as that happens, the thought occurs, well, perhaps Boris Yeltsin is winning after all.
No, it won't be me who decides that. What I can say firmly is that I am his supporter and a supporter of perestroika and the struggle of perestroika without sparing myself no matter where I work.
Someone said if you did what you did in the Stalin area, that you'd been shot. If you had done what you did in the Brezhnev area, you would have been disgraced and humiliated.
Certainly, of course. To have expressed it so bravely at that time, those consequences would have happened.
However limited the changes, these are still new times, and Yeltsin has not been sent to Siberia, but only down the street. What is the single most important change that has occurred in the Soviet Union?
I think the main change is the activism of the people. They seem to have been awakened from a hibernating sleep.
Thank you, Mr. Yeltsin. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Спасибо вам.
Up to $2,000 cash back from Subaru is worth more than the same money from anyone else. It's worth more because Subaru builds a rugged, reliable wagon that's the best-selling import wagon in America. It's worth more because Subaru's XT6 has the same engine design found in a Ferrari or a Porsche. It's worth more because the Subaru Justy is the lowest-priced four-wheel drive passenger car in America. Up to $2,000 cash back on a Subaru is worth more because it's on a Subaru.
You're listening to the highest standard for telephone clarity, an AT&T phone. But what about cordless phones? The trouble is too many of them sound like this. That's why AT&T developed this new generation of cordless phones with clarity that rivals our corded phones. Now, when you can buy a cordless phone that sounds like this, or an AT&T cordless 52 or 5300 that sounds like this, the clear choice is the right choice.
Is anything as lonely as an only cup of coffee? It doesn't have to be. Weight Watchers has gorgeous cake, beautiful pie. Bye-bye, lonely only, bye-bye. Weight Watchers, this is living.
If you're concerned about heart disease and your doctor advises exercise, the right foods, and an aspirin a day, you should know that heart specialists recommend Ecotrin more than Bayer when they're concerned about aspirin irritation because it's safety coded. Ecotrin, the one heart specialists recommend.
This is the Hall of Columns, perhaps best known to Americans as the place where the bodies of Soviet leaders, Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko, lay in state before being interred near the Kremlin wall. With me here tonight to discuss summit developments are our Moscow correspondent, Barry Peterson, our White House correspondent, Bill Plant, and our State Department correspondent, Wyatt Andrews, who also was posted here to Moscow for several years. Barry, how seriously did the Soviets take President Reagan reaching out to dissidents, refuseniks, and those who feel a strong tie to religion in this country?
Dan, I think they see it as an incredible slap in the face and nothing less, especially coming so early in the summit. The pictures of the meetings had barely been broadcast back to the United States before there were already stories and commentaries moving, and the attitude of the Soviets was, listen, if you want to talk about human rights, let's talk about Indians, let's talk about minorities in the United States. But there was something else significant today I think we should pay attention to. At the end of it all, there wasn't really condemnation. There was a sense of, okay, we've all got human rights problems. Let's solve them and get on to other things. Let's not make a big issue out of this.
And in the man-to-man negotiating sessions, any progress, Bill?
The U.S. thinks that it has made some progress. They proposed today, Dan, some very tricky proposals for verifying the number of mobile missiles. Now, the U.S. has been against the limitations on mobile missiles because they think the verification doesn't work. They have some new ideas today. It's still a long way from fruition. The Soviet spokesman said today that the deal was almost done. A U.S. official responded that if that was the case, we have a difference of opinion.
And when we speak of mobile missiles, we're speaking of cruise missiles as well.
We're speaking of a separate category of cruise missiles, air-launched and sea-launched, which still really haven't been worked out. A little more progress on air-launched than sea-launched, but they have a long way to go before they get to a START agreement, let alone anything else.
Are they agreeing on anything else, Wyatt?
Dan, sometime before the end of this week, probably tomorrow, they're going to sign 3 deals they've got already worked out. The first one is interesting. The U.S. and Soviets are going to conduct 2 joint nuclear test blasts this summer. They're already digging the holes for them in Nevada and here in the Soviet Union. So they've got that one ready. They can sign that anytime, probably tomorrow. They're going to extend the cultural agreement that has sent thousands of Soviets and Americans across the ocean to visit each other. They worked that out tonight. And the third deal is one in which both sides have agreed to tell the other on an early basis whenever they test launch a ballistic missile. This is sort of a mini arms control deal that they thought they could pull out of the larger one that they're negotiating. They felt like they had to sign something. It'll be that.
Very quickly, Barry, what are we to make of this Yeltsin interview? Taking on Legatchov, very straightforward. He's saying he's got to go.
I think Legatchov is in trouble. I think the conservatives are in trouble. And I think Gorbachev has said, I'm going to fight this one, and I'm going to win it. And if I don't win it, he knows he's dead.
Bill Plant, we will or will not have a 5th summit late in the year?
Very possible. The president wants a trophy to take away from here. That would include some real progress in arms control. If there is real progress in arms control, then there is probably a 5th summit meeting.
Thanks, Bill. Wyatt, Barry, we'll have more news after this.
Shopping. It can make you feel terrific. Especially when you find wonderful color, fabulous fit, beautiful style. But when you also find the Made in the USA label, you feel even better.
It's a great feeling.
Look for the Made in the USA label in apparel and home fashions because it matters.
Made in the USA.
What harm can a little water do? The damaging effects of water and time have always been wood's enemy. Introducing new Rust-Oleum Wood Saver paint, a special wood formula with Teflon for twice the moisture protection of ordinary paint. So if it's going to get wet, get Rust-Oleum.
Now for indigestion, gas, introducing new extra-strength Maalox Plus. It neutralizes more than any leading antacid and dissolves gas. Nobody does as much as new extra-strength Maalox Plus.
Where can you find America's best-selling camcorder outfit with a free $149 telephoto lens? Perfect. The case, camcorder, and accessories are all yours for just $26 a month. Where? Only at Sears.
This is the Soviet Union's own tomb of the unknown soldier, an eternal flame. It has been burning bright a lot longer than Gorbachev's perestroika and glasnost. And when it comes to the Soviet military, openness and restructuring still means fighting to dominate and win. CBS News Pentagon correspondent David Martin has a rare look inside the new Red Army.
A cadet at the Soviet equivalent of West Point learns to drive his first tank. For the moment, it's only a simulator, and the instructors assure us those are not scenes of Western Europe. Officers at the Malinovsky Tank Academy learn to adjust the engines to run on different fuel mixtures. In another classroom, a lengthy discussion on the workings of the automatic loader. This is the nitty-gritty of war, much more important to success in battle than the commando shows the Soviets love to put on. For all the talk of change, of perestroika, of restructuring, the Soviets are as intense as ever about preparing for war. Their obsession with tank warfare will continue no matter what deals are struck on nuclear weapons. Nevertheless, Defense Minister Dmitry Yazov claims there has been a fundamental change.
Right after Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary, the military doctrine itself changed. The main thing about the new doctrine is the idea of preventing war.
The task today is to repulse the enemy. We will deploy 1.5 platoons on the right flank.
The war games we saw all stressed defensive as opposed to offensive operations. Although judging by this one terrain table, the Soviet military motto should be Toys R Us. At every military academy we visited, the new doctrine was being drummed into Soviet officers.
Previously, the main goal was repulsion of hostile aggression. Our goal today is the prevention of a new war.
When you listen to the faculty here at the Armed Forces Staff College describe the new defensive doctrine,
The difference between that and the old military doctrine sounds very much like the difference between a glass half empty and a glass half full.
Certainly these cadets were practicing the good old-fashioned art of attack. Soviet officers are also learning the vocabulary of disarmament.
Dramatic reduction.
But as long as the Soviet Army possesses large numbers of tanks, American officials like Ambassador Maalox, here in a rare question and answer session with Red Army officers, will not be impressed by subtle changes in doctrine.
The NATO doctrine is also exclusively defensive. But what is more important than doctrine is the fact that the Warsaw Pact simply has more weapons than NATO.
So far, perestroika seems to have less to do with the tactics of war than with a general belief that change is taking place. If anything, perestroika will improve Soviet combat capability, not reduce it. So when you think of perestroika in the Soviet military, remember what the old tank professor said.
The only free cheese is in the mousetrap.
David Martin, CBS News at the Malinovsky Tank Academy, Moscow.
Americans and Russians share one old proverb. It goes along the lines, we sometimes may be beaten, but we are never defeated. Americans on Memorial Day remind themselves that winning has a high price too. Part of the agenda of the Reagan-Gorbachev summit is to try to make the world a safer place by trying to make it at least a little more predictable place. Maybe it's because of our Memorial Day, but this Soviet tomb of the unknown soldier looks a lot like monuments to dead soldiers everywhere and reminds one of the reality behind them. That's tonight's CBS Evening News. Dan Rather with Charles Carroll. See you tomorrow, again from inside the Kremlin. Good night.
Mom sure make life easier. Mine did. Like another mom, Phillips Milk of Magnesia. Phillips Mom helps your body work naturally for easy overnight relief. Even has this convenient dosage cup. Nobody treats you better than Mom.
Do it yourself. Do it for yourself. Do yourself proud with Minwax and Wood.
Wood finish for beautiful color like no other, and Minwax polyurethane for fast drying protection that lasts.
Do yourself proud with Minwax and Wood.
Why do they call it heartburn? When it's me, your stomach, that's hurting. When antacids don't stop the pain from coming back, it could be an ulcer. It's okay, because there are treatment programs to help heal ulcers. If you think you have an ulcer, go see your doctor and ask about the available treatment programs. Sponsored by Smith, Kline French, the ulcer experts. You could make your stomach very happy.
I always said, U.S. Navy is the best thing that ever happened to me. Then I met a former Marine fighter pilot, and he said,
"You've just won $10 million from American Family Publishers."
And that's another best thing.
You may be next. $10 million. All for you from American Family. The only sweepstakes with my picture. Be sure to beat this date. Enter now.
I'm Harry Smith.
And I'm Kathleen Sullivan. Tomorrow, Armand Hammer shows us his home in Moscow.
Also, Alexander Haig's view of the summit tomorrow on CBS This Morning.
This is CBS.